Solve this, and you'll get $100 million, the CEO joked, his voice a blade of pure contempt. He was pointing at a multi-billion-dollar failure on a holographic schematic, a catastrophic engine flaw that had stumped the greatest minds in aerospace engineering. He never expected the maid's quiet daughter, a 10-year-old girl sketching in the corner of the vast design chamber, to look up from her worn notebook and say, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "I can see the problem." Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Alastair Finch existed in a world of his own creation, a world forged from titanium, carbon fiber, and an ego as vast and cold as interstellar space. He was the founder and sovereign ruler of Finch Aeronautics, a man who had stared into the abyss of physics and forced it to blink. His office, perched atop a 100-story glass needle that pierced the clouds, was less a workspace and more a temple dedicated to his own myth. The air within it was different, filtered, chilled, and heavy with the expensive silence of absolute power. But for the past 6 months, that silence had been poisoned. It was tainted with the acrid smell of failure, a scent no filtration system could scrub away. The source of this stench was a project codenamed Prometheus, an engine that was meant to be his legacy, the final, gleaming jewel in his crown. Instead, it had become his torment. The Prometheus engine was a marvel of theoretical engineering, a machine designed to operate at efficiencies that bordered on impossible. It promised to shrink the globe, to make transcontinental travel as trivial as a bus ride. Billions in capital, years of research, and the careers of hundreds of brilliant engineers had been poured into its creation. On paper, it was perfect. In simulations, it was flawless. But in the real world, it was a bomb. For prototypes had been built. For times, they had been mounted in the heavily reinforced test cells deep beneath the Finch Tower. And 4 times, they had torn themselves to pieces with a violence that defied explanation. There were no warnings, no stress indicators, no gradual system decay. One moment, the engine would be humming towards peak operational velocity, a symphony of controlled power. The next, it would detonate, a chaotic shriek of shearing metal and vaporized fuel, leaving behind nothing but a crater of molten slag and shattered dreams. The world's best minds, lured to his company with obscene salaries and the promise of working on the future, were stumped. They had analyzed every component, run every diagnostic, and modeled every conceivable variable. The data showed nothing. The engine was, by all accounts, perfect. A perfect, self-destructing machine. How could a whisper of discord in the design scream so loudly that it shattered an engine designed to conquer the heavens? What infinitesimal flaw, invisible to every sensor and every expert eye, was hiding in plain sight, mocking him with its catastrophic silence? Alastair Finch was not a man accustomed to being mocked, especially by inanimate objects. He had built his empire on the bedrock of certainty, on the unshakable belief that every problem had a solution and that he was the man to find it. He had started with nothing but a brilliant mind and a ferocious will, clawing his way through the cutthroat world of government contracts and corporate espionage. He saw people not as collaborators, but as tools, some sharp, some dull, all of them disposable. His engineers feared him, his board of directors placated him, and the world at large admired the brutalist perfection of his creations. He was a man who saw the universe as a complex equation, and he had always been able to solve for X. But the Prometheus equation had no answer. This failure felt personal, an affront to the very core of his identity. It had made him volatile, his temper a storm cloud that perpetually hung over the entire corporation. His commands became sharper, his patience non-existent, his disdain for incompetence a palpable force that could wither a senior engineer at 20 paces. He was a king whose throne was beginning to wobble, and the terror of that instability was curdling into a constant, simmering rage. Into this high-stakes world of pressure and impending doom drifted Elena, a ghost in a gray uniform. She was part of the evening cleaning crew, a woman whose existence was defined by her invisibility. Her job was to erase the day's traces, to wipe away the fingerprints of powerful men from glass tables, to empty the bins filled with their discarded ideas, to vacuum the floors they paced in frustration. She was efficient, silent, and utterly unnoticed. She had a gentle face that life had etched with worry, but her hands were strong and capable. She had to bring her daughter, Lily, to work with her most nights. The cost of a sitter was a luxury she could not afford, and the long hours meant leaving her daughter alone was not an option. So Lily became a ghost as well, a small, quiet shadow who would find an out-of-the-way corner in the cavernous labs or empty boardrooms and lose herself in her own world. Lily's world was not one of dolls or video games. Her constant companions were a worn, leather-bound notebook with creamy, yellowed pages and a set of meticulously sharpened graphite pencils. While her mother polished the monuments to Alastair Finch's ego, Lily would sketch. But her drawings were not the typical creations of a 10-year-old. They were not pictures of houses or animals or smiling suns. They were intricate, complex diagrams of mechanical systems. Gears with perfectly rendered teeth meshed with impossible precision. Delicate escapement mechanisms from antique clocks were drawn with an architect's hand, and complex schematics of planetary gear systems filled page after page. She would often watch the engineers from her corner, observing the massive holographic models of engines and fuselages that shimmered in the air. She wasn't just looking at the pretty lights. She was tracing the flow of power, seeing the interplay of forces, understanding the silent, mechanical language that the adults in the room were struggling to translate. She was seen, in a literal sense, but she was never truly noticed. She was just part of the background, a small, irrelevant detail in the grand, failing tapestry of the Prometheus project. The fifth test was the final straw. It was not a private failure this time. Alastair, in a move of profound arrogance, had invited the entire board of directors and a handful of key military liaisons to witness what he had promised would be a flawless demonstration. He stood in the primary observation chamber, a sterile white room with a floor-to-ceiling armored glass window looking down into the test cell. With him were his top engineers, their faces tight with anxiety, and the board, a collection of grim-faced men and women who controlled the company's finances. Among them was General Wallace, a retired war hero with a mind as sharp as a bayonet and a reputation for unvarnished honesty. He was the one board member Alastair could not intimidate. Elena and Lily were there, too, tasked with keeping the observation chamber pristine, their presence as unremarkable as the humming ventilation system. The test began. The engine spooled up, its sound a rising, pure tone that vibrated through the thick glass. The readouts on the myriad screens were all green. Alastair's tense shoulders began to relax. A thin, triumphant smile touched his lips. He was seconds away from vindication. And then it happened. The pure tone was pierced by a discordant shriek, a sound so unnatural it felt like the air itself was tearing. Before anyone could process it, the engine vanished in a blinding flash of white light, the shockwave hitting the armored glass with the force of a physical blow. The screens went from green to a universal, screaming red. Failure. Total, catastrophic, and this time, public. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. It was the sound of billions of dollars evaporating. It was the sound of a legacy dying. Alastair's face was a mask of incandescent fury. He turned away from the window, his eyes sweeping over his terrified engineers. Explain, he hissed, the word a drop of acid. There were no explanations, only stammered apologies and panicked theories. His rage, with nowhere to go, needed a target. He gestured wildly at the giant holographic model of the Prometheus engine that still hung, pristine and perfect, in the center of the room. $100 million, he roared, his voice cracking. A board seat. My entire fortune. To anyone who can find the ghost in this damned machine. His wild, furious gaze swept the room, past the cowering engineers, past the stone-faced board members, and landed, with cruel serendipity, on the cleaner and her child. Elena had frozen, her hand instinctively on Lily's shoulder, trying to shrink them both into the wall. A nasty, mocking smile twisted Alastair's lips. It was a chance to deflect, to perform his power for his audience. Maybe you can help, he sneered, pointing a trembling finger directly at Lily. You've been sitting there watching us fail for months. See anything we missed? Solve this, little girl, and you'll get $100 million. A wave of shocked, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the assembled executives. It was a cruel, pathetic joke, the lashing out of a wounded animal. The engineers shuffled their feet, their faces a mixture of pity and embarrassment. General Wallace's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening into a glare of pure disapproval at Alistair's pathetic display. Elena felt a cold dread wash over her. She wanted to grab her daughter and run, to disappear from the crosshairs of this powerful, broken man. But Lily did not run. She did not cry or hide behind her mother. Instead, she looked past the furious billionaire, her eyes fixed on the shimmering, silent hologram of the engine. She tilted her head, as if listening to a distant melody. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying with astonishing clarity in the tense silence. "It's singing the wrong song." The room, already quiet, became absolutely still. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air, a bizarre counterpoint to the high-tech crisis unfolding. Alistair Finch stared, momentarily thrown off balance. He let out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. What did you say, girl?" Lily's gaze didn't waver from the hologram. "The resonance is wrong," she repeated, her voice steady and factual. "The harmonics are fighting each other. It's screaming, and you aren't listening." She finally turned her eyes to meet his. They were calm, clear, and held a depth that was unnerving in a child. "My great-grandfather taught me how to listen to machines." Alistair was about to unleash another torrent of scorn, but General Wallace stepped forward. "Your great-grandfather?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "What was his name?" Lily looked at the old general. "Anatoly Petrov," she said simply. A flicker of recognition, of profound respect, lit up the general's stern features. He turned to a stunned Alistair. "Anatoly Petrov," he said, his voice low and resonant. "The horologist. They called him the watchmaker. Legend has it he built chronometers for submarine captains during the Cold War. Instruments so perfect they could keep time to the millisecond in the crushing depths of the ocean. They said he could diagnose a faulty gear train by feeling its vibration through a solid steel table." The general looked back at Lily, his gaze no longer just curious, but intensely focused. The dynamic in the room had shifted. A ridiculous joke had suddenly become something else entirely. Alistair, caught between his own public declaration and the general's implicit endorsement, was trapped. His arrogance, however, was still his primary defense. "All right, little songbird," he sneered, gesturing to the main console with a flourish of false magnanimity. "The floor is yours. Show us. Show all these brilliant, useless engineers what they've been missing. Listen to the song." He crossed his arms, a smug look on his face, fully expecting to expose this as a childish fantasy and reassert his dominance. With a quiet confidence that unsettled everyone, Lily nodded. She walked away from her mother's protective side and moved towards the holographic control interface, her worn notebook clutched in her hand. The perspective of the room seemed to shrink, focusing entirely on the small girl standing before the massive, glowing construct of human genius. For Lily, the room and its occupants faded away. The fear, the tension, the mocking face of the CEO, it all became a dull, distant hum. All that mattered was the machine. It was not a hologram to her, not a collection of data points and light. It was a living thing, and it was in pain. Her great-grandfather's workshop materialized in her mind's eye, a warm, safe space that smelled of brass, lubricating oil, and old wood. She could almost feel the weight of a complex watch movement in her small hands, the faint, rhythmic ticking a tiny heartbeat against her palm. She remembered his voice, a low rumble like perfectly meshing gears. "Don't just look at the parts, Lilia," he would say, his large, callous thumb gently guiding her finger over a spinning balance wheel. "That is the architect's job. An engineer must listen. Every machine has a voice. A happy machine sings in harmony. A broken one, it screams. Long before the metal breaks, it will tell you its troubles. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Lily turned to the lead engineer, a man with a doctorate from MIT, who now found himself taking instructions from a 10-year-old. "Can you run a low-power simulation of the primary turbine assembly?" she asked, her voice polite and direct. "But can you isolate the audio signature and amplify it? I don't need to see the stress data. I need to hear the vibrations." The engineer, utterly bewildered, looked to Alistair, who gave a curt, impatient nod. The man typed a series of commands. The larger hologram faded, leaving only the turbine assembly suspended in the air. A low hum filled the room. Lily closed her eyes. She was not just hearing with her ears. She was listening with her entire being, just as Anatoly had taught her. She felt the frequencies, sorting them in her mind, identifying the pure tone of the main shaft, the higher pitch of the compressor blades, the steady rhythm of the fuel injectors. It was a complex orchestra, but underneath it all, there was something else. A thin, high, dissonant note. It was almost inaudible, a tiny thread of wrongness woven into the symphony. "There," she whispered. She opened her eyes. "Can you isolate component 734 Bravo?" A vibrational dampener strut on the main bearing housing. The engineer, now moving with a strange sense of purpose, brought up the component. It was a tiny piece of metal, no thicker than a pencil, seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of the massive engine. "The material," Lily said, her focus absolute. "The specifications say it's AT5 titanium alloy. It's too rigid. It's too perfect." She walked over to the large whiteboard where complex equations were still scrawled. She picked up a marker, and in small, neat handwriting, she began to draw. It wasn't calculus. It was a simple sine wave. The primary turbine, when it approaches 70,000 RPM, creates a harmonic frequency. "It's a clean wave, a pure C-sharp," she explained, drawing the wave. "This strut is designed to absorb that vibration, to dampen it." She drew a second, smaller line showing the dampener absorbing the wave. "But it doesn't. The alloy is so rigid, it has no give. It doesn't absorb the note. It reflects it." She then drew another sine wave, perfectly out of phase with the first one, originating from the strut. It reflects the vibration back at the turbine shaft, perfectly out of phase. It creates a counterwave. A scream. She looked up at the stunned faces of the engineers. On its own, it's nothing. A tiny vibration. But it's a standing wave. It doesn't dissipate. With every single rotation of the turbine, the scream gets louder. The two waves, the engine's song and the strut's echo, begin to feed each other. It's called destructive resonance. She drew the two waves merging, amplifying each other, the peaks growing higher and higher with each cycle. It builds and builds, an invisible vibration shaking the turbine shaft faster and faster, until the sheer stress is more than the metal can bear. It doesn't bend. It shatters. The song breaks the singer. She put the cap back on the marker and set it down gently. The explanation was simple, elegant, and utterly devastating in its logic. It was a truth they had all missed because they had been looking for a structural flaw, a material defect, a mathematical error. They had been looking with their eyes and their computers. They had forgotten to listen. The lead engineer, his face as pale as chalk, stumbled back to his console. His fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting Lily's theory into a new simulation. He modeled the warring frequencies, the standing wave, the exponential growth of the resonance cascade. The entire room held its breath, their eyes glued to the main screen. For a few seconds, the simulation ran green. Then, as the virtual RPMs climbed, a red warning flashed. Then another, and another. The screen filled with a catastrophic failure prediction, a perfect match to the real-world explosions. He had found the ghost. Or rather, she had. Without a word, the engineer ran a second simulation, this time replacing the titanium strut with a nickel composite alloy, a softer, more absorbent material. The simulation ran. It reached peak RPMs, and it stayed green. A solid, beautiful, perfect wall of green. The problem was solved. Alistair Finch stood as if he had been turned to stone. His jaw was slack, his skin a waxy, unhealthy color. The carefully constructed universe of his own genius had just been shattered by a 10-year-old girl. A child he had mocked. A child he had used as a prop for his own pathetic rage. He had an army of experts, a budget that could fund a small country, the most advanced technology on the planet, and he had been beaten by a girl with a pencil and a lesson from her great-grandfather. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He was not a king on a wobbling throne. He was a naked emperor, and a child had just pointed it out to the entire world. The silence in the observation chamber was broken by a single, sharp sound. It was General Wallace, bringing his hands together in a loud, deliberate clap. Anatoly Petrov would be immensely proud of you, young lady, he boomed, his voice filled with genuine admiration. He walked over to Lily, who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. He did not pat her head or treat her like a child. He looked at her as an equal. You have a remarkable gift, he said. Then he began to applaud in earnest. For a moment, no one else moved. Then, one of the younger engineers joined in, then another. Soon the entire room, the board members, the military men, the humbled PhDs, erupted in a thunderous ovation. It wasn't for Alastair Finch. It wasn't for Finch Aeronautics. It was for the small, quiet girl in the oversized sweater who had heard a song no one else could hear. Later that night, long after the stunned board members and relieved engineers had departed, Alastair Finch requested that Elena and Lily meet him in his cavernous office. The rage was gone, stripped away by the raw, humbling power of the truth. All that remained was a profound sense of awe and a deep, burning shame. He stood not behind his immense desk, but in the middle of the room, looking small in the vast space. He looked first at Elena, who stood protectively beside her daughter. I owe you both an apology, he said, and the words felt clumsy and foreign in his mouth. He had never apologized to anyone in his life. He then knelt, a shocking gesture from a man of his stature, so that he was eye level with Lily. And especially to you, he said, his voice quiet and sincere. I was arrogant, I was cruel, and I was wrong. You possess a gift that is rarer than any element on earth. You are a true genius. He stood up and walked to his desk. I made a promise, he said, turning back to them. A stupid, angry joke. But it will be honored, he addressed his chief counsel, who had been waiting silently in the corner. Draw it up. A trust fund for $100 million, to be established in Lily's name. It will be called the Petrov Innovation Fund, for her education, her research, whatever she desires for the rest of her life. She is never to want for anything. He then turned to a stunned Elena. And you, Elena, your days of cleaning are over. I am creating a new position, effective immediately. Head of Quality Assurance Oversight for the entire Prometheus project. Your job will be to watch, to observe, to find the things that our engineers miss. You will report directly to me. Your daughter has taught me that the most brilliant insights can come from the quietest corners. 1 year later, the world of aerospace was dominated by the hum of the Prometheus engine. It was a triumph, exceeding all expectations and ushering in a new age of travel. Finch Aeronautics was more successful than ever, but it was a different company. It was led by a different man. Alastair Finch was still brilliant, still demanding, but the cruel arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility. He was known to listen more than he spoke, and he often sought the advice of his youngest and most brilliant consultant. Elena thrived in her new role, her innate practicality and quiet observational skills making her an invaluable asset. Her life, and her daughter's, had been irrevocably transformed. And Lily, now attending a prestigious institute for gifted minds, spent her weekends not in a stuffy classroom, but in a state-of-the-art laboratory built just for her on the top floor of the Finch Tower. It was a space filled with light, technology, and the faint, comforting scent of brass and oil, a scent Alastair had gone to great lengths to replicate. There, surrounded by the tools of the future, she listened to the songs of new machines, her great-grandfather's legacy alive and well, nurtured by the very man whose world she had saved by hearing a single, discordant note. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.